Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. There is a span of 8 months between last week's elections in Israel and the anticipated U.S. elections, which are scheduled for November 3rd. During this time, Jerusalem's next government and the Trump administration will have to manage the political, diplomatic, and security aspects of their relationship as they lay the ground for a more thorough review of their unique alliance. To analyze the special relationship between the two countries, we're joined here in the studio by Ambassador Yoram Ettinger, who is an expert on Middle East and U.S. Israel relations. Welcome.
Thank you.
I'd like us to welcome our TV7 analyst, Mr. Amir Oren, and Mr. Robert Silverman, who is a lecturer at Shalem College and former president of the American Foreign Service Association. Welcome.
Thank you.
Mr. Oren, give us a broader understanding on this unique alliance between the United States and Israel.
Well, if you're asking for the more general context, obviously, ever since the end of World War II, there has been built a solid relationship between Washington and Jerusalem, which had at its roots moral feelings of guilt for not helping European Jewry during the Holocaust, help for the establishment of the State of Israel and bolstering its security against the surrounding Arab countries. And regarding the strategic value of Israel, first during the Cold War and then against jihadism and terrorism, Israel is now seen as a bulwark against many negative vectors in the Middle East. And of course, the United States is Israel's great friend and benefactor. But if you're asking more specifically about the relationship between the current Israeli government and the current American administration, self-serving statements aside, it is indeed true that the relationship between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu is very strong. There's a personal bond between them. The downside is that both Trump and Netanyahu represent only one half of the electorate in their respective countries, and that those so-called anti-Bibi segments in the Israeli political elite and the Democratic Party and other segments of the American political elite resent the Trump-Netanyahu relationship and several of its aspects. And we can then, of course, go on regarding the so-called deal of the century and other programs. So come November, we will see whether President Trump will be reelected or whether his Democratic rival will be inaugurated next January. And we may see a term not liked so much by Israeli governments, a reassessment in Washington of the Israeli file.
Ambassador Ettinger, you've served as the Israeli ambassador to the United States and had the opportunity to understand the close dynamic between the two nations. I'd like to ask you about the present time, however. To what degree is the strategic cooperation between the two countries, considering the fact that not all of Israeli interests are necessarily in line with American interests when it comes to Middle Eastern affairs?
Well, first of all, a correction. I was not the ambassador to the States. I was an ambassador at the Israeli embassy.
Indeed.
However, when it comes to the bilateral relations, there has been a dramatic transformation of Israel during the last 34 years, and much more so in the last 5 or 10 years, becoming the major force multiplier for the United States, and I would venture to say much more than even NATO alliance, especially because of the mutual threats to both countries, the Ayatollahs of Iran and ISIS, as well as potentially Erdogan of Turkey. All pro-American Arab countries in the Middle East consider Israel to be their most effective life insurance agent in the region. Israel serves as a major power of deterrence against the very, very endemic enemies of Jordan, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Abu Dhabi, and Dubai. And in fact, in Israel, politically, other than the one Arab party in Israel, all other parties consider the U.S. to be the top ally of Israel. And to sum it up, I would say if 50 to 70 years ago it used to be a one-way street, U.S. gave and Israel received, in the last 50 years, and especially the more recent years, it has become a very, very busy two-way street serving American as well as Israeli interests.
Mr. Silverman, last week, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo addressed the powerful AIPAC conference, during which he noted that prior to relocating the U.S. Embassy in Israel from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, he received a letter from some 109 Congress people who actually were alarmed by the American move, urging him not to follow through on it, while citing different analysis or circumstances that may evolve out of such a situation. Of course, the Trump administration did not succumb to this pressure and followed through. You served in the embassy here in Jerusalem and had the opportunity of doing so in a senior post. To what degree is the significance of the U.S. Embassy here in Jerusalem? And are we in a position right now, prior to the upcoming U.S. elections on November 3rd, should we be concerned here in Jerusalem about various statements about, for instance, frontrunner of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, who said that he may reevaluate once again relocating the embassy from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv?
Right. So great question. And I would say not to worry, but to work on that relationship with the U.S. Excuse me. You mentioned the perfect storm that could happen if you have the progressive wing of the Democratic Party's candidate, Bernie Sanders, win the election, and then a center-right government here in Israel of Netanyahu. There will be some frictions there, no doubt, in this very powerful relationship which my colleagues described. But I would just remind people this relationship, as close as it has been, has always had its ups and downs. It's a very dynamic relationship. I was first here as a political officer in the early 90s when you had the first President Bush and Prime Minister Amir, when the U.S. denied $10 billion in housing loan guarantees to Israel at a time when it needed those guarantees to build housing for newly arrived Soviet immigrants. So in every period, there's ups and downs. If there is going to be a President Sanders and a Prime Minister Netanyahu in the fall, we'll have another one of those periods of close management.
Indeed.
And I would say the basis for the relationship, nevertheless, will remain very strong, as my colleagues described. Yeah.
Mr. Oren, last week was also a point that signified the close military relations between the United States and Israel, the biannual training exercise that is done by both respective aerial defense system of the European Command as well as the Israeli Air Force. To what degree is this relationship really solid? Are there different elements within it that we could see even further expanding on this close relationship in order to execute certain operational proceedings that would benefit both Washington and Jerusalem?
The military relationship between Israel and the United States has evolved over many years and several presidents. Up until 1967, France was Israel's major arms supplier. It sold arms to Israel. It did not give them free of charge, as the United States is basically doing. And only ever since 1967, gradually has the United States become Israel's major suppliers with F-4 Phantom fighters and other sorts of material. Of course, during the Yom Kippur War, the nickel grass operation, the resupply effort which Israel urgently needed. And following that and following the Camp David Accords, Israel not only has been getting $2.2 billion, then $3.5 billion a year, but also a promise kept to have its qualitative military edge over any Arab combination kept, which means that Israel gets the latest technology, and if the Saudis or others get a similar piece of machinery, it's downgraded a bit. It never equals Israel. However, Israel always, or at least until the early 1990s, when Bob was here, Israel prided itself on seeing the United States, as Churchill said, only as the arsenal of democracy. And Moshe Dayan used to say, we don't want any American soldier to come fight and shed blood for us. This changed during Desert Storm when the first Patriot batteries were stationed here because Israel didn't have any anti-missile capability. The exercise which you are referring to, Juniper Cobra, is an offshoot of that. And what has happened is that EUCOM, the European Command, which in the American scheme of things is in charge of Israel, has been exercising, drilling with Israel the protocols in place so that if there is an Iranian attack on Israel, we won't have to start from scratch. Officers and enlisted men meet, exercise. They have common language and practices. And of course, the Americans also, again, as Yoram says, Israel has a lot of experience with Iron Dome. Almost every week they have to intercept incoming rockets, which is not something which the Americans are used to. And so the Americans get a lot from the Israeli experience. It's for everyone's mutual benefit.
I think it's important to say that the Memorandum of Understanding, or at least the last one that was signed between the United States and Israel under the Obama administration, and specifically, it was revised to a certain degree because up until then, Israel could use a small margin of that incoming money in order to also invest in its own military industry. Now, under the Obama administration, that was closed down, and all of the money that Israel receives must be invested solely in American industries in order to purchase equipment that is later also used by Israel, but is aligned with U.S. policy for Middle Eastern affairs.
Well, let me say a word about it. Even though my two colleagues have worked at it from different angles. Americans don't like foreign aid. They don't see why they should give their hard-earned dollars to foreigners. One way to bypass that is to tell them, listen, it's not just money that we are throwing at the Israelis. This has to do with jobs at Fort Worth, Texas, or any other place where the Israelis come and buy F-16s. So everyone wins. The engineer in Dallas, Texas, the congressman and senator from Texas whose constituency is for it, and of course the Israelis. And actually Israel has been getting a voucher, not money per se, but a voucher. Please go to Lockheed Martin, present this voucher, and get one F-16. Now, 1/4 of the amount was given to offshore procurement, which you are referring to. And this was done in order to stabilize the Israeli government because small businesses in peripheral communities such as Beit Shan or places like that needed employment. This is no longer the case.
Ambassador Ettinger?
A major feature of the bilateral relations has been Israel serving as the most cost-effective, battle-tested laboratory for the American armed forces as well as for the American defense industries. Every single combat plane, every single military system which we receive with much gratitude from the Americans is employed under battle conditions. We have shared thousands, literally thousands, of lessons learned by Israel on the battlefield with the American manufacturers, which has spared those manufacturers billions of dollars, which they would have spent on research and development. It has enhanced their competitiveness in the global market, which has increased American export, and it has expanded the employment base of the American defense industry, and at the same time providing the American Air Force, the Marine Corps, and other military forces with a very rare experience of Israel on the battlefield.
Mr. Silverman, to what degree is the bilateral relations between the United States, especially when we're talking about security and political backing, if you will, which is also part, of course, of that security, bipartisan also at this stage of this relationship when we see more and more division on core principles and issues within the United States?
Right. Well, let me just add first
Go ahead.
Another point on the foreign aid. The context is U.S. foreign military assistance worldwide is always for procurement in the U.S. Other countries do the same thing. When you get foreign military aid, usually much smaller from a European country, it's to purchase that country's goods. Now, Israel had an exception for 1/4 of its U.S. military aid could be procured in Israel. That was an exception that is not anywhere else. So Jordan doesn't get that exception. Egypt doesn't get that exception. Saudi Arabia, of course, buys the material, doesn't have foreign aid. The exception is gone away. It could be restored. It depends on the administration. I would say it remains very bilateral, bipartisan, this relationship. You mentioned the AIPAC conference and Pompeo speaking. Also spoke at the conference was Senator Cory Booker, who is a strong progressive from the progressive wing of the Democratic Party. That was an important speech. Several of his colleagues, of course, boycotted the AIPAC conference, but not all of them. So the progressive wing is out there. Members of it are skeptical, if you would, about some of the benefits that we've been talking about and need to be persuaded. It depends on what their electorate is telling them. But there are members of the progressive wing of the Democratic Party who remain solidly with Israel. And I think, again, it's a matter of engagement and staying engaged.
Mr. Oren, I'd like to ask about the current challenges that Israel is facing. To what degree is there an American readiness to fight shoulder to shoulder vis-a-vis its regional enemies, whether it is common enemies like Iran, but let's say hypothetically, if Turkey would attack from the north, as it does right now in Syria, and continue south for what we hear on different levels of the Islamic ideology of theirs to liberate Jerusalem. We see it also a lot on social media that the Ottoman Empire should be revigored and reinvented. It's a NATO member state since the 50s. It is a partner of the United States. Of course, it's not on the same level with Israel, but there's been fluctuating relations between the two countries. How would the United States treat such a situation?
Well, it's a bit far-fetched to see the United States fight one of its NATO allies. Right now, the trend is in the opposite direction. Turkey has asked the alliance to convene under Chapter 4, so that not Chapter 5 here, Chapter 4, which is only consultations. It has not asked for direct intervention on its behalf. And one doesn't really see how American planes flying out of Incirlik in Turkey intercept Turkish planes over Syria or asking Israel to do it. And as for the general question, again, the Trump platform is in the opposite direction. It's America first. Let's end our military involvement abroad and specifically in the Middle East. Let's call our boys home. We have seen the accord with the Taliban in Afghanistan. It doesn't seem as if President Trump, of all people, would like to start a new fight in places where he says there is only sand and blood.
So, amplifying, of course, the fact that President Trump is an isolationist, America first, and so on, Ambassador Ettinger, do you see the United States using Israel or other partners in the region, for that matter, for its foreign strategic interests, considering that it is very much keen on returning all of its soldiers back to the United States?
The more removed the U.S. from the Middle East, the more important Israel becomes, because Iran's ayatollahs are a real and clear threat to the U.S., not only to Saudi Arabia or Israel. There is a reason why the ayatollahs are involved in the trilateral border of Argentina, Paraguay, and Brazil, or the trilateral border of Bolivia and Peru and Chile, and are very deeply involved in Cuba and Venezuela and Mexico, and with some sleeper cells in the US itself. They are the epicenter of proliferation of nuclear technologies and ballistic technologies threatening the USA. It's Israel in the Middle East which extends the strategic hand of the US without requiring a single American soldier. And when it comes to facing Israel's own threat, the last thing that Israel should do is relying on American soldiers. Israel, in my mind, has done it until now and will do it in the future, making it clear we are going to fight for ourselves. We will help the US, but we will not ask American soldiers to fight on our behalf.
Well, actually, there are US servicemen in Israel manning a radar station on an Israeli Air Force base, because this is a very sophisticated system and it is turned vis-a-vis Iran. If any missile comes over the horizon, the Americans will give Israel early warning.
Which is aligned with U.S. interests on this.
Of course, no, but the statement that no Americans will fight for Israel, they could become casualties in such a fight.
There is a
Silverman.
handful. Yeah, Amir is correct, yeah. Small.
To what degree do you see the United States further bolster? On what areas would you see the need to bolster the relations further? Also considering the fact that the bipartisan support that the State of Israel used to receive historically is not necessarily there on the complete sense of things.
Right, and I would also say there's a bipartisan sense of withdrawing our troops from the intense engagements we've had in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And so that's a bipartisan feeling too. I remember, of course, we all remember President Obama talking about a pivot to Asia. And these sentiments have continued in this administration. I do not think that you can ever disengage. You know, there's the old statement of Trotsky, you may want to disengage from us. We don't want to disengage from you. The U.S. may want to disengage from the Middle East. The Middle East doesn't want to disengage from the United States. And so there's the threat of terrorism. There will be many reasons why there will always be U.S. bases in the region, U.S. forces, maybe not as, the 100,000 that we used to have in Iraq or the 25,000 we currently have in Afghanistan. But there will be a presence here. And I believe that Israel, as our colleagues have stated, it's the core stable ally in the region. We're aligned democratically. We are aligned strategically. There's going to be frictions. There have been in the past. Every administration has its ups and downs. When you have this close, if you would, familial relationship, you're going to have some frictions, and the key is to manage them.
With regard to U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who also served previously as the director of the CIA, the Central Intelligence Bureau, to what degree do you think that the administration, considering his understanding of the region also from an intelligence perspective, do you believe that there is an understanding of the importance of having a U.S. presence in the region?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes. And there are advocates within the administration for having a very robust presence. And these fights, these intramurals, if you would, within the administration, goes on in every administration. But at the end of the day, the president makes the decision. That's the person that's been elected. And this president, like President Obama, senses that the American people are a little bit fed up with the intensive engagements, the $1 trillion expenditures in places like Iraq, and that flows over to some things like Syria. And people do want to bring the troops home. The United States does not see itself as an imperial power, is not interested in colonies or such, has never been interested in that. And so there's a strong sentiment to go, but our interests require a presence here, a military presence, diplomatic presence, and that's going to remain.
Well, we're drawing near to the end of the program, so I'd like to give each and every one of you the opportunity to have a closing assessment on the future relations between Jerusalem and Washington. Ambassador Ettinger, we'll start with you.
Well, when you look at the Israeli scene, there is a common denominator among left and right of center parties, and this is the alliance with the U.S. And in fact, compared to any other country in the world, we have been the most systematic, the most reliable, and the most effective ally of the U.S., whether it's a right of center prime minister or left of center prime minister.
Mr. Silverman?
Well, I agree with Yoram. I'm very optimistic about this relationship. There are going to be some ups and downs, just like there have been. And there might be some real downs if you have a President Sanders and a Prime Minister Netanyahu. But the core relationship is there. The countries are aligned. I'll give you one stat. I'll just give you one
Very
statistic.
shortly.
I was political counselor at the U.S. Embassy. What is the embassy in the world that gets the most visits of Congress? It's not London. It's not China. It's not Moscow. It's Israel.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
The U.S. does not need a large footprint in the region intelligence-wise. It can eavesdrop from above by remote means. It can run agents from afar, but it does need Israeli expertise on whatever happens in this region. And there is a very close relationship between Israeli military and intelligence officials and their American counterparts.
Well, this is all the time that we have for today, so I'd like to thank Ambassador Ettinger, Mr. Oren, and Mr. Silverman for being here with us today. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well, and we will see you next time.
You just watched TV7 Jerusalem Studio. We encourage you to pray for the challenges raised in today's program. If you were blessed by our production, please consider supporting TV7 Israel. The details of our respective bank accounts for donations from Europe and the United States appear on the screen. Your generosity allows us to continue to serve God's calling, to broadcast content that truly matters through TV7 Israel from Jerusalem.